Meanwhile, Russia and Iran have inked a deal detailing their joint efforts to tackle the sanctions imposed by the West. The deal comes ahead of the Russian president's visit to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. On Tuesday, the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and also his Iranian counterpart signed a declaration that this was during his visit to Iran for the annual meeting of the foreign ministers of the 5 littoral states of the Caspian Sea. The two nations have declared that they will now collectively be working on countering, reducing and compensating the negative consequences of unilateral sanctions imposed by the Americans.
Мы подписали только что декларацию о путях и средствах противодействия, смягчения и компенсирования негативных последствий односторонних принудительных мер. Безусловно, это важный шаг в наращивании координации усилий членов мирового сообщества по преодолению незаконных санкций, которые США и их союзники сделали заменой дипломатии.
The declaration has come ahead of Putin's working visit to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia today, after which the Russian president will also be playing host to the Iranian president the next day. The oil market scenario and also Israel's ongoing war on the Gaza Strip remain on the agenda. Now, Putin will first be meeting with the United Arab Emirates president and then with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Now, the Russia-Saudi ties have been instrumental in bringing the OPEC Plus to life. Last week, this forum had agreed to voluntarily cut the supplies of oil by about 2.2 million barrels per day, helping Russia with the idea of reversing the sanctions that had been imposed on the Russian oil trade. And this is in line with Putin's drive to bolster ties with the Gulf and other West Asian states, in an attempt to demonstrate that the West's attempts to isolate Russia have completely and categorically failed. And also to give us more perspective in terms of what, of course, is happening in terms of the Russian and other efforts in order to overcome the sanctions that are imposed by the West, we're being joined by Professor Glenn Deason, who's joining us live from Oslo. The Professor Glenn, in fact, teaches international relations at the University of Southeastern Norway. Professor Deason, this, of course, is a crucial moment in international diplomacy because the Russian president is visiting the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. Now, ever since the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the West has been using the one weapon that it has been using very effectively for the last so many decades. And these are sanctions that the West, predominantly led by the United States, uses to enforce and try gets of the other nations online. But the fact that Russia has managed to blunt the impact of the Western sanctions and the fact that Russia is forging closer ties with not just Iran, but also with other nations such as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, clearly points to a new emerging front to blunt the impact of Western sanctions. How do you read this development?
Well, I think this is a correct analysis. As we see, the European economies are suffering greatly while the Russian economy is growing. So this is obviously not the way sanctions are supposed to work. On a much wider context, the objective, of course, was to simply create pain for Russia with the assumption that in the future normality will be restored. But the first thing they teach you about sanctions is that excessive and prolonged sanctions teach the rest of the world to live without you. And so the objective of Russia is to create new permanent economic connectivity with the non-Western world in order to permanently reduce its dependence on the West. I don't think people often don't grasp how huge this is in Russia's history, because 300 years ago, Peter the Great attempted to modernize and economically develop Russia by linking it closer to the West. Now, this is a 300-year period in history which has come to an end. Russia now sees its main development in the future being by connecting to the East or the non-Western world. And of course, the Middle East is an important component of this greater objective to diversify economic connectivity and also integrate this greater Eurasian space economically.
Right now, and also what is interesting is the context in which all of this is happening. There was the Russian invasion of Ukraine that's been ongoing. Russia says the reason why it has had to invade into Ukraine is because it feels threatened by the ever-creeping expansion of the NATO military alliance and also the conflict that has now broken out in the Gaza Strip, where the United States and its Western allies have backed Israel to the hilt, but the Arab nations want the United States to take a completely different approach, and therefore they now appear to be relying more on the Russians. Do you think the Russians would be willing to weigh in on the conflict that is presently underway between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip?
I think so, because the way the Russians see it, and also many of the Arab states, is that the United States has effectively forfeited its role in the Middle East. Because, you know, the US claims to oppose the bombing of civilians and ethnic cleansing, yet they continue to send the weapons which enables the Israelis to do this. The US also claims to support a two-state solution, but at the same time they have for decades systematically undermined it to the point that the two-state solution is now dead. I think that in the past Russia was not really ready to take a larger role in the Middle East, but it obviously has more neutrality and ability to negotiate with all parties. But even in the past, I think the Russians were more likely to tilt towards Israel because of a long shared history. The Soviets liberated Auschwitz. There's a lot of Russians in Israel. Mm-hmm. However, I think after Israel sent all these weapons and instructors to Ukraine, effectively to kill Russians, this has severely damaged the relations. So this ability now of the Russians to lean more hardly in favor of the Arabs is something, and the Palestinians, something we haven't seen before.
All right, very interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Glenn Deason, for joining us and getting us that perspective there.
My pleasure.
WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.